You're standing in ancient Sumer. It's 6000 BC. The sun is going down over Mesopotamia. There's no Netflix. There's no phone. There's no passive-aggressive work email that somehow found you on a Sunday. There's just you, the heat, and a clay tablet sitting in front of you that someone clearly thought was important enough to preserve forever. And somewhere at some point, one of your ancestors looked at a completely ordinary flower, made a tiny cut in it, watched something strange ooze out, and thought, wait, what if I just tried this? This is the story of how humans discovered opium, not the opioid crisis, not prude pharma. We're talking about the very first time a human being figured out what the poppy plant could do, and why that moment might be one of the most consequential accidents in the entire history of our species. Because here's the thing, nobody tells you. Opium doesn't start with the Opium Wars. It doesn't start with the British Empire or China's collapse or anything you read about in school. The desire to use this plant might go back so far, it predates civilization entirely. And the evidence for this is genuinely insane. Before we get into the evidence, we need to understand something first, because you can't understand why the poppy mattered without understanding the world it appeared in. Think about pain, not the kind where you take something from the cabinet and lie down for a bit. Real pain, a broken bone with nothing to take, a wound getting infected with nothing to stop it. In the ancient world, pain wasn't just something unpleasant, it was dangerous. A person in serious pain couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't do any of the things a body needs to do to actually recover. And healers, for most of human history, had almost nothing that genuinely worked. They had some plants that helped a little, some rituals that helped sometimes, a lot of hope, and not much else. So imagine being that healer. You've watched people suffer your entire life. And then one day, something comes along that actually works. Pain stops. The person relaxes. They sleep, they eat, they recover. And you have absolutely no idea why, but you know with complete certainty that you are never letting this thing out of your sight. That's the moment the story of opium begins. Not in a laboratory, not with a plan. With a healer who found something that worked and had the sense to remember it. Now, it gets more interesting. By the time the Sumerians are writing things down, and these are the people who basically invented writing, cities, and organized accounting all at the same time, so they were genuinely not messing around. By the time they're carving records into clay tablets, the poppy already has a name. Hulgil, the joy plant. The Sumerians recorded everything: grain supplies, trade disputes, legal agreements, tax records going back thousands of years. If something made it into the written record, it mattered. The joy plant made it in. Which means by 3400 BC, this wasn't a new discovery being written down for the first time. This was already established, already trusted, already widespread enough to have an official name in the world's very first writing system. Think about what that means. The oldest writing we have about opium isn't someone figuring out what it does. It's someone writing instructions for people who already know what it does, which means the actual discovery goes back even further. How much further? We don't know. Organic material doesn't survive the way stone does. A pouch of dried plant resin doesn't last thousands of years in the ground. We find stone tools from 3 million years ago because stone is basically indestructible. Dried plant material is basically not. So the absence of older evidence doesn't mean it didn't happen earlier. It just means whatever existed didn't survive long enough for anyone to find it. The written record is almost certainly not the beginning. It's just the beginning of the part we can see. But here's what most people get completely wrong when they hear about the Sumerians and the joy plant. They picture ancient people using it recreationally, getting pleasantly hazy after a long day of inventing civilization, which honestly sounds like a completely reasonable life choice, and nobody here is judging that. But that's not what the tablets say. They're not party instruction. They're medical records, specific doses, specific conditions being treated. These were healers working with something they understood was powerful, and treating it with the seriousness that kind of power deserves. From Sumer it moved, the way useful things always move, along trade routes, through conquests, carried by travelers who brought their knowledge with them and left it behind wherever they stopped. By 1500 BC, it had reached Egypt, and the Egyptians, who were always exceptional at recognizing something useful, immediately made it part of everything. Ancient Egyptian medical texts describe opium preparations for pain, sleep, calming people before procedures. And then there's the detail that always makes people stop cold. They gave it to children, to quiet crying infants, which sounds alarming, but it also tells you something important about what these people actually knew. You don't adjust doses for a child unless you have generations of accumulated knowledge behind you. You don't do that by guessing. These were practitioners who understood exactly what they were working with. Meanwhile, in ancient Greece, Homer described a substance in the Odyssey that erased grief and pain so completely a person forgot their suffering entirely. Historians believe he was talking about opium. Hippocrates, the same physician whose name is on the oath every doctor takes today, wrote about poppy preparations for multiple conditions. And here's the part that should genuinely stop you. The word narcotic, which we still use right now today in 2026, comes from the Greek word for numbness. They built the vocabulary we still use around this plant 2,500 years ago. For thousands of years, across Sumer, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and Persia, opium was medicine, carefully used, passed down through generations of healers who understood both what it could do and what it could cost. Ancient writers described dependence, described what happened when someone used it too long and then tried to stop. They were not naive. They were careful in the way people are careful with something genuinely powerful. And then something changed. Not the plant. The plant has never changed, not once. What changed was who was holding it and what they decided it was worth. Arab traders carried opium east along trade routes into Persia, India, and eventually China around the 8th or 9th century. For a long time, it remained largely medical. Then tobacco arrived in Asia from the Americas in the 1600s, and people started mixing opium with it to smoke. That single change, just the delivery method, nothing else about the substance itself, transformed everything. Smoked opium hits faster and harder. It's significantly more addictive than eating it. The use that followed spread through China at a speed that should feel very familiar to anyone who has ever watched something addictive arrive in a society that had no framework for handling it. And then the British Empire showed up with ledgers and a plan. Here's the part that is genuinely hard to sit with. By the late 1700s, the British East India Company controlled massive poppy-growing regions in India. They processed the harvest and shipped it into China on a deliberate industrial scale. Between 1729 and 1839, the volume went from 200 chests a year to 40,000. They weren't meeting existing demand, they were manufacturing it, on purpose, building addiction into an entire population. Because addiction is extremely good for business, and the British East India Company was focused on business. When China figured out what was happening, millions of people addicted, the country's silver draining out to pay for it, entire communities collapsing. They tried to stop it. They banned the trade, destroyed shipments, wrote directly to the British Crown asking sincerely how a civilized nation could do this to another people. The British went to war. Twice, the Opium Wars, fought specifically to protect the legal right of a private company to keep selling an addictive substance into a population that desperately wanted it to stop. China lost both times. The trade continued. At its peak, somewhere around 25 to 30% of adult Chinese men were addicted to opium. The same compound Sumerian healers carved onto clay tablets as medicine for people in pain, now used as a deliberate weapon against an entire civilization. A healer in ancient Sumer and a British trade official in 1800 both worked with the exact same plant. They had almost nothing else in common. The gap between those two people is one of the larger moral distances in all of human history. So, when did ancient humans first use opium? The honest answer is we don't know exactly, and we probably never will. The written record takes us back 8,000 years. The physical evidence takes us back at least 3,400 years. The actual first use goes back further still into a time when nothing was written and nothing organic survived long enough for anyone to find. What we do know is this. For most of human history, opium was exactly what the Sumerians called it, the joy plant. It answered a question that nothing else could. That question hasn't changed. Pain is pain. It was true years ago in Sumer, and it's true right now in every hospital room where a morphine drip is doing exactly what a Sumerian healer was trying to do with a clay tablet and a poppy pod. The tools changed completely. The question didn't change at all. The only thing that keeps changing is what we decide to do with the answer. Sometimes we use it to help people. Sometimes we use it to control them. And somehow, after 8,000 years of history, after everything that has happened, we are still working out which one we are doing. Next time you walk past a garden and see a flower you don't recognize, just know. One of them changed the entire course of human history and is still changing it right now today.